Okay, today we're doing Sim Kuf Yud Halacha Gimel about Kol Kavuah and Kol D'Parish. So, most of Hilchos Taruvos is about situations where we have a mixture of foods. Some is kosher and some is not, or things like that, and you don't know which is the heter, which is the iser. But that means is that the main point is what we do is all kinds of questions, but the main point is we can't get the iser and the heter to separate from one another. But there's a whole different set of halachas. That's what we're going to talk about today. When we have, we know exactly what the iser is and what the heter is. It's very clear which one is which, but somehow there's still a suffix anyhow. And the beginning of that is what's called Kavua, which comes from the Gemara like this. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Chacham hold that there's three cases there are two cases where a person would be chayiv for killing somebody else. One is if he tried to kill one Jewish person and he killed a different Jewish person, the Chacham hold you're chayiv in that case. Second is if I shoot an arrow into a crowd of people, of all Jewish people, I don't have any specific person in mind, but I want to kill somebody, not caring who it is, and in the end I end up killing someone who's Jewish, and again I'm chayiv also. Okay, that's the second case. But I'm not chayiv if I try to kill someone who's not Jewish and end up killing a Jewish person in the end. Okay, now when I say chayiv, I mean is Beis Din won't punish the person for that. Whether Hashem punishes, that's Hashem's responsibility, whether he holds him liable or not. We're just talking about whether Beis Din can do anything about that. Okay, so the Gemara says is that there's a pasuk that teaches us the following: that you're also not chayiv in a certain variation of the second case. The second case was I shot into a crowd of Jewish people. I had planned to kill somebody. I didn't care who. And the person who died, of course, was Jewish because that's all the people who were there. What happens is if I had a crowd of people that had a lot of Jewish people in it, and some people who are not Jewish, the majority of the people were Jewish, the minority were not Jewish, and the person who I end up killing is Jewish. Okay, so you would think you go bus a roiv, which to say is that the person, since most of the people are Jewish, we should say it's like the case where I shot into a crowd of people who are all Jewish, and I had in mind to kill somebody. So here also, the Roiv should tell me I had in mind to kill one of those people in the crowd. Well, the Roiv is Jewish people. You would think that the Roiv would tell us that that's what, so to speak, what I had in mind, in which case I should be chayiv. But the pasuk tells you that you're not chayiv. And the reason why you're not chayiv is because of a rule, which the rule comes from this pasuk, that teaches us, Kol Kavuah kamechza mechza. And that means is, when we know which is the heter and the iser, like in this case, we know exactly who in the crowd is Jewish and who is not Jewish. That's not a question. We know exactly who it is. Then, even though there are more of one than the other, there's more Jews than non-Jews in this crowd, we treat it as if it's kemechza mechza. We do not follow the roiv. We would have thought we would follow the roiv like for all the dinim in the Torah. But in truth, we do not. And we say it's kemechza mechza as if it's 50-50. And so then there's no majority. So if it's half Jews and half not Jews, then the person wasn't specifically trying to kill someone Jewish. He was now it's like the third case where he wasn't trying to kill someone Jewish, in which case, even though the person in the end who was killed was a Jewish person, we say he's not chayiv in Beis Din because he was shooting into a crowd that the din considers to be half Jewish and half not. And that's the rule, Kol Kavuah kamechza mechza. It comes from this din. Now, there's another Gemara. This Gemara is in Shulchan, and says, applies that same rule to another case, and that is if you have a city that has 9 kosher butcher shops and 1 non-kosher store, and you buy a piece of meat from one of the stores, and you don't know which store you bought it from. So again, Kol Kavuah kamechza mechza tells you that we don't say that the person went into a kosher store. Holchanach HaRoiv would have told you that, so it would say you probably went into a kosher store because the Roiv is kosher. So the assumption you would think would be is that he went into the kosher store. But since the stores are identifiable, it's clear which is the kosher store and which is not. Therefore, it's considered kavua, and therefore the suffix. Therefore, we imagine as if there's half kosher stores and half non-kosher stores. There aren't more for this decision. It's not. We don't say that there's a roiv of kosher stores. It's kemechza mechza. It's like half and half kosher and half non-kosher, and therefore the meat is usher. Since there's an equal chance that you bought from the kosher as if you bought from the treif. Okay, that's Gemara's application of the din of Kol Kavuah to a case of kosher and treif meat. Now, the Gemara then says another thing, and that's brought in our din here in Halacha Gimel. And that is, the only time we say Kol Kavuah K'mechza Mechza is when the suffix starts at the place where the Kavuah is. Like in our case, which store did the person walk into? So the shaila is at the point where the kvias is. But what happens if the story was different, and instead of the person walking into a store and not sure which store he walked into, but rather what happened was he found a piece of meat in the street, and he doesn't know whether the piece of meat came from the kosher store or the tray store. So then the question is not which store I went into. That would be the question about that happens at the Kavua. The question is, where did the meat leave from? So then we have a different rule. It's called Kol D'Parish from D'Parish. Excuse me. We assume that when something leaves from a group, when it was parished from the group, we assume it came from whatever the majority is, and therefore we can assume that the meat came from one of the kosher stores, and ignore the possibility that it maybe came from the tray store. Okay. Now there may be special Rabbanan chumras for certain cases, but as a rule, that's what the rule is. We say Kol D'Parish, and we assume that it came from the whatever is the majority, which in this case is the kosher stores. Okay. Now, but all these cases where we said Kol Kavuah, either the Jew and the non-Jew, we try to kill somebody, or the kosher and the not kosher stores, is that Kol Kavuah. The point is that Bitul can't possibly say that the people who are not Jewish are Jewish, or that the non-kosher store is kosher store, because everyone could see very obviously that those things are not true. The shaila is rather, we have something from the outside that acted on. You walked into a store, or you shot into a crowd, and the question is, which one were you trying to do, or which one did you actually do? So that's different than regular Bitul. Okay. Anyhow, all these things that I've said until now of Kol Kavuah K'mechza Mechza is something that the post can refer to as Kavua D'Oraisa. Okay, a lot of what I'm going to be telling you, that I already said and that I'm going to be saying, comes from the way the Binas Adam, Chachmas Adam clarifies this. I mean, everybody says this same thing. Not much difference on the of opinions about this, but I'm just the structure of how I'm saying it. A lot of it comes from the Chachmas Adam, and we call this a Kavua D'Oraisa. Okay, this is what the Torah calls Kavua, that says Kol Kavuah K'mechza Mechza. Okay, but now there's another case, which is not an example of kavua that I've just been telling you, but it has a similar halacha. Okay, and that comes from a different Gemara, a third Gemara now, Gemara in Zavacha. And it's talking about a case where I have an animal that you can't use, it's not suitable for a carbon, and it's mixed in with other animals which are meant to be carbonas. And at this point, I don't know which animal is which, so we have one animal that's not good for a carbon, and the rest of them are meant to be carbonas. So the Gemara says is the animal that's not good for a carbon can't become batal, because as we said last time, Baalei Chayim are loy b'teili. Baalei Chayim are too choshev, too significant to be batal. So the animal that's not, we can't say that there's bitul baroi and all the animals are good for a carbon. Okay, so then that's the starting point. We can't. All animals are not okay. So the question is, okay, so let's just take one animal out and take one animal out of the group. And when we take an animal out of the group, we'll say Kol D'Parish from D'Parish. That would let us assume that, let's say there were 5 animals that were suitable for karbanos, and there's one that's not. If I take one out, I assume it came from the 5. Okay, so the Gemara says is that no, you can't do that because it's kavua, and if you take one out of the kavua, it's not. Doesn't qualify for Kol D'Parish. Now, what does that mean? Why is this case kavua? Kavua, I told you at the beginning, kavua means is that I know which is the isser and the heter, or in this case, which is good for a carbon, which is not good for a carbon. And that's obviously not true over here. If we knew which one was which, we would just pull the bad one out, and that would be it. It would be obvious. So obviously, the animals all look alike, and there's no way to know which is the one, or whatever. There's some confusion. We don't know which is the one that could be a carbon, which one can't be. So, so why is this a case of kavua? What's the kavua over here? So that tells us, excuse me, that when Chazal tell us that certain things can't be batal, because like in this case it's Baalei Chayim, or Chatichulis Kabed, or Dafrish Minyan, or something, one of those kind of things that can't be batal, what they did was, they said, the way they structured that Isser was to say is, pretend it's look at this as if it's Kol Kavuah K'mechza Mechza. just like in cases of Kol Kavuah, we say we can't change the status of the thing. The treif store is still the treif store, and the person who's not Jewish is still not Jewish. We can't change that, and we just look at it mechza, and we can't make a decision about this suffix. So over here also, when we have something that midrabanan can't be batal, we look at the mixture, this taruvas that we have as if it's kavua, and we can't, meaning we can't come to a decision about it. We can't follow majorities to come to a decision about it. That's similar to the rules of kavua. We can't use the roiv to make our decision, and therefore it's kavua midrabanan. Okay, and so that's what we call we are midrabanan, applying the rule of Kol Kavuah k'mechza mechza. Now, it's not a real Kol Kavuah because we don't know which is the Isser and the Heter. That Kavuah means we have to know which one of the Isser and the Heter, which we don't over here. But it's like Kavuah, midrabanan, it's treated as if it's Kavuah. Okay, so that means is, last time we spoke about this, I told you that a drum of animal-based glycerin is considered davar minyan, which means is it can't be batal, or the 4 quarters from a whole animal is a chatichru is kabin, it can't be batal. So if that drum of treif of animal-based glycerin was brought to a factory, and now we don't know which one it is. There's 100 drums, and one of them is this one, or one of the 4 quarters is treif, and we don't know which one it is. It's mixed with the other ones. Then everything is treif, either because it's davar minyan or chatichru is kabin, and now we could also rephrase this and say this is a kavua d'rabanan. Till now, we'd say it's a davar minyan, it can't be batal. And now we've learned a new term that we can call it a kavua d'rabanan, midrabanan. It's as if it's called kavua, and Kol Kavuah k'mechza mechza, and things, and we cannot say bitul in that case. Now, we also saw the Gemara says is, I told you already that you can't you can't pull an animal out and say Kol D'Parish. So the Gemara says, well, if there are ways that you could, in our case of karbanas, back to the Gemara in Zvachim, we had one animal that's not suitable for carbon, other ones that are. Now there are ways that the animals could separate from each other, they could just disperse, and then it would say Kol D'Parish, and then each animal that we would see would be considered mutter. We would say it came from the majority who are kosher for a carbon. So the question is, are you allowed to do that? Could I do that? Could I disperse the animals in a way that would make it not Kol D'Parish? So the Gemara says no, you're not allowed to do that. The Chazal specifically said you're not allowed to do that, and that's because if Kol D'Parish, if you'd be allowed to separate the group in a way that would allow for Kol D'Parish, then people might end up just taking animals out of the state while they're in the kavua state before they got separated from each other, and which would not be that would be kavua, or in this case kavua d'rabanan, and therefore, so even though it should qualify as Kol D'Parish if you separated the animals, and so to speak, it would if you did that. But the Gemara says you're not allowed to do that. You can't do that because Chazal were concerned if you did that, you might end up actually taking the animal from the kavua before you did this Kol D'Parish, made into a Kol D'Parish situation. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says. So the question is, okay, wait a second. We had another Gemara I mentioned to you beforehand that says if you have 9 kosher butcher shops and meat separated from them, the Gemara says you do say Kol D'Parish. So why in that Gemara, in the Gemara in Chulin, does Kol D'Parish work by the case of Kavua d'Oraisa, by the case of the 9 butcher shops, and one piece of meat is found out in the street, we don't know which store it came from, we say, yeah, Kol D'Parish, and it works fine. And Chazal don't stop you to say, no, if we let you Kol D'Parish, you might do Kol Kavuah. And in the case of the animals, we say, no, you can't say Kol D'Parish, and we say, once it became Asr as Kavua d'Rabanan, then it stays Asr, and Kol D'Parish is not going to make the difference. Okay, what's the answer to that question? So, the Rishonim give 2 main answers. There's a Rashba and a Rosh. Each one who gives a different answer to this question. The Rashba says, the reason why the Gemara in Zvachim says you can't have Kol D'Parish is because the person was deliberately switching something from Kavua to Kol D'Parish. So if the person was purposely going from Kavua to Kol D'Parish, then Chazal were concerned, maybe he'll go straight to the Kavua. He'll go straight to the Kavua itself without making it Parish first. And that's why the case in Zvachim, we don't say Kol D'Parish, because if you would force the animals to a situation called D'Parish, you're doing it deliberately, then you might just skip that whole step and go ahead and take the animals while they're in the Kavua state also. But in the case of the butcher shops, then the people, no one chose to separate the meat from the store. It was innocent. They just found, they just bought the piece of meat was just randomly found out there. It was just parish by itself. So then, or parish without anybody deliberately trying to separate and switch around this taruvis to make it from a kavua to a parish, and therefore the meat is mutter. So now, just related to that, before we go on to what the Rosh says, I'll mention to you, Rav Henkin speaks about that maybe that should tell us that there should be an isser to buy something, to buy something that was already parish. Maybe that in itself has some isser to it. Also, he talked about it Indian tuna fish. Okay, I'll put that on the side for now. Okay, so that's what the Rajba says. The Rosh has a different answer to why one Gemara says Kol D'Parish works and one doesn't. So the Rosh says the only time Chazal said not to rely on Kol D'Parish is when there's a realistic possibility that if we would be matir Kol D'Parish, then people might go ahead and take from the kavua, might choose to take from the kavua, or skip a step and go to the kavua. So he says that makes sense when we're talking about kavua d'Rabbanan, like the carbon case, because over there the animals are all mixed together. No one could tell which one is the isser and which one is the heter. So if we let the person take the animal after it's parish, he might take it before it was parish also, because why wouldn't he? He would just go skip a step. In contrast, by the case of kavua d'oraisa, with a 9 kosher butcher shops and the 1 treif one, the person, who's shomer Torah mitzvahs, he would never take from the store that he knew was treif. There's no possibility that he would take from the kavua. He might be it's possible, Kol D'Parish might happen, but there's no chance that he would go ahead and take from the kavua. Of course, by the case of kavua d'oraisa, where the isser and heter are it's obvious which is isser and which is heter, of course he's not going to take from the isser. There's no chashash like that. So therefore, Kol D'Parish, Chazal are happy to rely on Kol D'Parish. But only in the case of kavua d'Rabbanan, where again, in case of kavua d'Rabbanan, we don't know which is the heter and which is the isser. So it's not obvious at all which is which. So there, if Chazal would say if Kol D'Parish would be permitted, you might end up taking from the kavua also. So they therefore said don't take from the Kol D'Parish because you might take from the kavua also. Now, the Rosh says once I told you that that's the logic of it, I have another case where it would be mutter. Now this one is sort of counterintuitive, and that is like this. The Gemara says according to the Rosh, the Gemara is saying is if people might choose to take from the kavua, if there's a possibility people might take from the kavua, then that's the case where Chazal asked even Kol D'Parish. He says, okay, what happens then? He says, but what happens if the item was parish before anyone realized there was isser mixed into it? Okay, no one. Before we realized that, let's say the karbanos were mixed together, he's not a karbanos, but let's say in the karbanos, before anybody knew that they were mixed together, one of them had separated. So he says, at that point also, nobody would have realized that they shouldn't take from this group, because at this point, no one even knows that there was one non-kosher thing got mixed into it, one non-kosher carbon got mixed into there. So the whole reason to ask Kol D'Parish is because we're concerned if you're not to Kol D'Parish, then it might encourage people to take from the kavua. He says over here, there's no reason to worry about people taking from the kavua because they would take from the kavua. There's at that point it's mutter to take from there. So it's not going to encourage people to do something that they weren't going to do anyhow. They would have done it anyhow because they had no reason not to. He says, Mamela, you could say for those things, it's Kol D'Parish will work. So it seems backwards. It seems like over here it should be, you think you might be more machmer. He says, no, the whole time we only machmer on Kol D'Parish in cases where that might lead you to inappropriately take from the kavua. He says, but here, there's no possibility to take from, there's no reason, that's not going to stop you or wouldn't make a difference, because at that point in time, before anybody knows about the isser, you would happily take from the kavua without thinking that you're doing anything wrong. So that we don't need to do something to restrict you from doing that. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch, that's in Halacha Vav, says like the Rashba, that Kol D'Parish is amata items, whether it's kavua d'oraisa or kavua d'rabbanan, and you only can't rely on Kol D'Parish if the person intentionally took it from the group. Okay, so the Rajba is in that way is a kula that he's saying is you can rely on Kol D'Parish even by kavua d'rabbanan, assuming the person didn't do it intentionally, wasn't trying to get around the Isser. Okay, but in Teres Chatas, the Ramah brings both shitas, the Rajba and the Rosh, and says it's better to be machmer for the Rosh. And the Achronim all talk about, well, what's the actual din? Like the Pri Megadim says, no, in the Ramah, which was written later, in the Shulchan Aruch, when it's written later, he doesn't bring that shita, so he thinks he's chayzer from that, and he really holds like, he could be make like the Rajba. But the Taz and the Shach say, no, they say, be'etzem you should be machmer for the Rosh. The Chacham Sodom says, and a lot of other Achronim say, that you should be machmer for the Rosh except in case of Hefsed Meruba. Okay, so now let's think about how this applies to a case we talked about last time, or a variation of that, or I just mentioned it beforehand, which is at 10 o'clock in the morning, someone realized that there was a treif drum of glycerin or a treif 4/4 was mixed in with all the other ones. Okay, and we don't know which one it is. So everything is asur. That everything that's here, that's now in the warehouse, is asur because it's kavua d'rabbanan. It's a davish minyan, or it's a chatichul iskabed, and therefore the whole whatever is here in the warehouse is treif. Now, but any drums, what about and any drums that were taken out before 10 o'clock in the morning are also going to be mutter. And that's because both the Rosh and the Rajah would be matter. Let me explain the after 10 o'clock case better. That'll explain. If you take a drum out of the factory, let's say at 11 o'clock in the morning, they shipped out drums, not maliciously. Someone just randomly, they shipped it out of the house. So the Rajah would say, it's okay, because it was parish. Nobody intentionally took it out because he was trying to get around the Isser. They're just randomly. The next delivery went out, and it would be mutter. But the Rosh will say is, we cannot be matter it, because since they were taken out after we discovered the Kavua d'Rabbanan issue, therefore, at that point, Kol D'Parish does not work since the Kavua d'Rabbanan was already discovered. Okay, now, drums that were taken out before 10 o'clock, both would be makel, because the Raj would be makel because it was done intentionally. Obviously, no one even knew there was a problem, and the Rosh also, again, it was done in a way, it was what I mentioned, the special kula of the Rosh. It was done at a time when there's no reason to sort of knas people to prevent them from being parish, because at that point it would be mutter even take from, it would be perceived to be mutter take even from the kavua, and therefore there's no issue. Okay, so this thing that I told you about taking a drum out of the factory, that's a simple Kol D'Parish. But there's other things, there are other ways to qualify to be parish also, even without physically separating the thing from the rest of the whole group. And one is, like if there was a shinui to it. Okay, like let's say we had taken the 4/4 and cut it up into smaller cuts before 10 o'clock, then that would also be considered Kol D'Parish. It didn't separate physically from the group, it's still in the same place, but that also, the person can say that's also considered to be parish by cutting it up. Okay, and now a little bit more questionable is, what happens if nothing changed about the item, and it didn't really leave the premises, but it's somewhat separated. Okay, so this is Chacham Sodom, Chasam Sofer, and the Bisisra talk about this and say like this: if it just temporarily moved, like let's say there were a bunch of animals walking together, and one of them happens to walk a step ahead of the other ones or a step behind the other one, that doesn't count. That's not parish. That didn't separate from the group. Or what happens if there's 10 pieces of meat and I pick up one and I'm saying, should I buy this one? Should I not buy that one? That's also not parish. That's also considered a temporary movement that's not considered to be parish. But I'm sort of skipping some details over here. But what happens if the meat moved around within the store or the house in a way that it left the room that it was in and it's not coming back? Okay, it left, but it's not coming back. It didn't leave the overall premises, but it went from one room to the other one. Like, for example, a store realized that they have treif meat in there, and they don't know which one it is. Some of the meat that they got was treif, and so it can't be Bitul. And so the meat in their storage, in their walk-in refrigerator, is all considered to be treif because it can't be batel. But meat that was moved to the display case in the front of the store, that would be considered to have been parish, even though it's still in the overall store. It's still in that store, but since it was parish from the original place where the taruv was happened, that's considered to be called the parish, and that meat is going to be, assuming Roy was mutter, that would be mutter also. And it comes from the Chasam Sofer talks about a case where again they shechted some geese and had a similar kind of a case. And I skipped some of the details of this. So now all of this that I'm saying to you sounds a little bit theoretical. I'm talking to you about drums taken out before 10 o'clock and after 10 o'clock, or they moved the meat they made a shino in the meat, they cut it up a little bit, or they moved the meat from the walk-in refrigerator in the back to the cooler in the front. All these things sound somewhat theoretical, which I guess they could be. But Mir Hashem, next time we're going to talk about how all these are very lamaisa practical questions unfortunately, when there are cases of kashrus scandals, where all of a sudden a store is discovered that they had treif meat in them, and a lot of these rules that I've been talking about are going to come into play in those kind of cases. So this is just a warm up. Those are unfortunately real situations that happen, and this is just a preparation of the details of the structure, the nuts and bolts of what it takes to decide whether those should be mutter or not. So now that's going to be for next time. But we have one more thing to talk about, not so much to do with Kavua and Kol D'Parish, but relating to Kol D'Parish, and that has to do with Pesach. Okay, and that is a very common case for regular people, not scandal, just regular people, and that is like this. There are certain ingredients which some companies can make them out of chametz, like wheat, but most of them in the United States will be making them out of kitnias, out of corn. Okay, and an example of that is white distilled vinegar. There is a manufacturer in the United States who makes it out of wheat, but almost everybody else makes it from corn. So, am I allowed to keep that vinegar over Pesach? You're not allowed to own chametz, but you're allowed to own kitnias. So, am I allowed to own that over Pesach? Should I say that this Kol D'Parish tells me that it probably came from the majority? The majority of the vinegar is kitnias. So, could I say Kol D'Parish? I assume that mine came from kitnias. Or the same idea also about starch in let's say in a medicine or in a food. So I don't know whether this is wheat starch or corn starch, but the roiv in the United States is going to be wheat. It's going to be corn starch, kitnias. So the person is, let's say we have a person who's sick, who's allowed to eat kitnias, but he's not allowed to eat chametz. So can he say Kol D'Parish and assume that what he got was from the heter, from the kitnias, rather than from the chametz? So at first glance, seems very obvious. Yeah, why not? Kol D'Parish is Kol D'Parish. Roiv of it is like this, so it should be mutter. Okay, so there is a Gemara in Pesachim that is relevant to this, and that is the Gemara says it was a pile of chametz, one pile of chametz, and a bunch of piles of stuff that was not chametz, and a rodent took a piece from one of the piles and brought it into the house. And the Gemara says you say Kol D'Parish, you assume that the rodent took from the non-chametz pile, and you could be makeup. Okay, so there's a machlokes now. Rashi Tosfos what the Gemara is what's the case that the Gemara is talking about? Tosfos says that you're allowed to eat. If you have that food in your house, you don't know which pile it came from. Tosfos says you're allowed to eat it on Pesach. That's because we say Kol D'Parish says that what you're eating is not chametz. It came from the pile that's not chametz, and therefore go for it. You can eat it on Pesach. So Tosfos is very clear that the way Tosfos learns the Gemara is saying is Kol D'Parish even allows you to eat the food on Pesach, just like any other issur, which is not something surprising about that. Now Rashi learns the Gemara differently. Rashi learns the Gemara is talking about bedikas chametz, which is to say the animal took something into the house after you had done bedikas chametz, and the Gemara, and you want to know is, do I have to check my house again? Do I need to do bedikas chametz again? And on that we say is Kol D'Parish. We could assume that what the animal took in was not chametz, and therefore the chiyuv rabbanan of bedikas chametz does not apply to you. Okay, so according to Rashi, the Gemara didn't specifically say that Kol D'Parish works even for chametz and Pesach, but a number of the Achronim say that why not? The Gemara might not say it, but why shouldn't Kol D'Parish work anyhow? This is a Pri Chadash, Nechazanish, and El Yerabah, and some others who say it might not be. It might not be that the Gemara says that, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be. And the thing we have to just think about is a Chok Yaakov. Chok Yaakov says that since there's a chumrah of eating chametz, a person should be machmir and not be samach on Kol D'Parish. And the Mishnah brings this, okay, that you should not be samach on Kol D'Parish. So if when you just read that by itself, you say, "Oh my gosh, that sounds like this case that I gave, like the vinegar and the starch and things like that. We should not be samach on Kol D'Parish." That's what Chak Yaakov said. Don't be samach on Kol D'Parish in eating chametz on Pesach. Okay, but the things like this, the Marsham asks on the Chak Yaakov. He says, "I don't understand." Mechaber says later on, different din. Where is this din? Taf Samach Zayin Halacha Daled says that you could be samach on broi to assume a food is not chametz. So why wouldn't you be samach on Kol D'Parish also? That's what he asks on him. He says, why not? If you're allowed to do that, why not to this either? Okay, so to answer that question, if we look more carefully at the Chak Yaakov, we're going to see that he's answering that question. Because the Chak Yaakov says like that, when he explains why you should be machmir, he says like this. He says, nearly the aimless machal kulazul halacha. When he says, don't be samach on Kol D'Parish, don't be samach on this. Why? Don't be samach be'isur chametz, the chamer, for chametz, which is so chamer, le'inyan bitul yosem mishar yisurim. It's so chamer, way more than other yisurim that it's not batal. We know it's also b'mashu. So you shouldn't be samach on Kol D'Parish. So that means to say is he's not saying that you shouldn't be samach on Kol D'Parish. It's another example of just like chametz asa b'mashu. So this is another example. Of a chumrah relating to bitul in the chametz. Now that rule that chametz is b'mashu, this little chumras of chametz being batal, all those chumras apply only on Pesach. Those chumras don't apply before Pesach. They only apply if something happens on Pesach. If bitul, like some kind of bitul kind of a thing, happens on Pesach, then we say no bitul, extra chumras of Pesach. But bitul that happens beforehand, there it's the same. Okay. So their things are the same. So that means is all the Chak Yaakov is trying to say is that if something is parish on Pesach, we wouldn't say Kol D'Parish, we would parish on Pesach because it's a chumrah Pesach to treat it more strictly than other things. But he's not saying that you shouldn't say Kol D'Parish if it happened before Pesach. Okay. And we could see something like this that the Beis Yosef brings from Iran in a later din, who wants to know whether Kol D'Parish works for a Davar Sheish Matirin. The reason why the Ran says why you should think that it should not work is he says is since even a Davar Sheish Matirin is not batal even be'elef, so too maybe Kol D'Parish shouldn't work either. It's the same idea, which is when we have things that are not batal even be'elef, means their bitul rules are way stricter than anything else. Then Kol D'Parish, which is a type of a bitul, a type of a permission, say it's mutter because it was parish from the heter, we should also not be working over here. So here also, all Chak Yaakov is trying to say is that at the times when chametz is b'mashahu, then Kol D'Parish shouldn't work either. If so, that means is that if it happens before Pesach, like in the normal cases that we have, you want to know the vinegar in my house, it was parish from the factory long before Pesach happened. So the question is, was it parish from the kitnius factory or from the chametz factory? So I say, Kol D'Parish tells me it came from the kitnius factory, or the starch came from kitnius, and therefore I'm allowed to, I should treat it as if it's kitnius rather than treating it as if it's chametz.